We are absolutely thrilled to welcome today Philip Ackerman-Leist, all the way from the US of A, wonders of modern technology. So Philip's a professor at the School of New American Farmstead at Sterling College in Vermont. And I was just having a quick look at the website for the college, and I noticed one of the taglines was, be here, live small, think big. And I thought that's, I think we'd all agree that that's a lovely sentiment and something that we're trying to do as much of here. So Philip is an author of 3 books, which includes Rebuilding the Foodshed, How to Create Local, Sustainable and Secure Food Systems, which is what you're going to talk to us about tonight. And in Philip's own words, he was rather smitten by the process that we underwent through the community conversation that we held in New Mills in March this year, and the subsequent book that was published, the New Mills 2030 Vision. So I'll pass over to Philip now to talk a little bit about this and his thoughts about what we can do here in New Mills. And if anybody has any questions throughout, then please feel free to use the chat. They'll either be answered if appropriate, or we can move to them at the end of what Philip has to say. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll pass over to Philip. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Penny, and thanks to you and to Phil for arranging this. And it's just my great pleasure to be able to get to know Phil all virtually. We've never touched one another here as of yet, or shared a pint or anything else. But by virtue of the course that we shared together over the spring, and I'll come back to that just a little bit. In fact, I see Rupa is also here, who is in the course. So that's great to see you there, Rupa. And yeah, it's just it's always a pleasure to compare ideas, notes, perspectives, strategies, and so that's what I thought we'd be able to do here, and do it in somewhat of a more intimate fashion. I decided this time not to do this by way of a PowerPoint, just because sometimes that doesn't feel quite as personal in these scenarios. And so instead, what I did was I put in the chat a Word document that references various organizations, initiatives, websites that you might find interesting to pursue afterwards that I'll mention as we go along here. So that's there for you as a Word document. But it really was so fascinating. I think I actually first saw it by a tweet that Phil sent out, the New Mills book that you put together. And, I loved it. I loved the look. I love the strategy. I'm truly moved by it, and really commend you for what you've done. I think it's fantastic when you can bring together a community in that kind of a fashion. So, I'm not coming in as an expert, about New Mills, that's for sure. Here in the States, sometimes we say you're an expert if you're coming in from 50 miles away, but I think all that means is that I'm so far away that I totally lost expert status by the time we hit the topics. But perhaps by sharing some things that I've seen, heard, bumped into here in the States and elsewhere, perhaps there's some things there to talk about. So I thought I'd take about 15 minutes just sharing some impressions with you by virtue of having looked at your book, and I have I've also, I've Google Earthed you, so I've seen your public spaces. I probably peered into some of your private spaces, and tried to get a little bit of a feel for the lay of the land there, and then also looked at the New Mills Wikipedia page, which was fascinating, just to get more perspective. So again, there's so much that I don't know, but it's been fun to just have a little building awareness there. So, as we dive in, one of the things that I thought was just beautiful about the process that you did was involving Hazel Ashworth, the 12-year-olds, and that for me just really signaled what we should all be doing. I mean, so many of these conversations that we're having end up being somewhat sequestered in terms of generations, and that just can't be the case. And when we think about food systems and we think about food sheds, then what we're really talking about are things that are very much generational. And here in the United States, when I talk about rebuilding the food shed and, with the book tour and various conferences and things afterwards, I often mention the fact that we really here in the States spent about 3 generations tearing apart more integral food systems that were in place. They weren't perfect, before that, but we've really spent the past 2 to 3 generations just breaking apart those local food sheds. And so now the task is upon us to reassemble those. And that work is hard, it's long, it requires vigilance, and it's never done. And it is a passing of the baton of the understanding of the food systems, and also always trying to transition those into the next best thing as best we can. So, when I was looking again at Wikipedia, and as I was thinking about what might your food shed look like by virtue of your book, Wikipedia, Google Earth, I saw the Swizzles Matlow factory, and I don't know whether you're including that in your food shed or not. So I was trying to decide, how does one think about that? But then when I saw that you had the conversation lozenges, I thought that's perfect, because the scholar who we were following in our course that Phil and Rup and I did together, David Fleming, talks about addressing any problem by starting a conversation. So perhaps we can have some conversation lozenges to help us along in that regard. So you're producing a good for the world that we much need in the US as much as anywhere else. I was also really fascinated to look and see also the role that water power has played there. I've always been a fan of the Archimedean screw, and saw that you have this Archimedean screw turbine, which apparently you've nicknamed Archie, which I thought was classic, good British humor. And, and I'd like to think about that energy aspect a little bit and get your perspective on that. I also noted that that turbine is actually providing power to the co-op as well as other places. And so part of what I'd like to do is introduce the question of energy and food systems into the conversation that we have here a little bit too. First, I'll give you just a little bit of background and context. Welcome to my barn. This is where with the internet service being in the barn better than in the house, this is where I've spent the past several pandemic months. And I have here my family and I in acres. We've got about 97 acres that we own, and another 60 that we lease, and we do grass-fed cattle. I want to thank you and the British Heritage for that. We have what are now called American Milking Devon cattle. It's actually a breed that came from Devonshire in 1623 with the Puritans who came with the second shipload. And so they're the oldest cattle in the United States breed-wise, and they've really, I'm interested in them because the body frame is just really the perfect size. It's kind of a middle-sized cow, very low center of gravity, great legs and backs and hoof structures. And so the American Milking Devon, which is the breed that spun out of the Devon cattle, they're a really magnificent, beautiful breed that are adapted, to grass, to the climate here that can be really rugged, to being outdoors. They're also the cattle that were considered triple purpose, which you all know about, I'm sure, in terms of not just dairy or beef, but also draft. So they were the animals that built the famous stone walls of New England, were the Devon cattle here. So, thank you for that. And the Devon cattle, you'll be glad to know, live on the Vermont state flag. And I will be talking about Vermont in various ways, obviously, because I'm here and I know it intimately, but it is also a model here in the United States for food systems. So I'll share a little bit more on that in just a minute. I also was moved by the fact that you opened your session, your visioning session, with a Wendell Berry quote. And we actually, as you may or may not know, we have the Wendell Berry farming program at Sterling College, which is an offshoot that we have in Kentucky, which is run by Sterling and the Berry Center. And so it's Wendell Berry and his family have the Berry Center in Kentucky. And it's a model you might want to think a little bit about. Tuitions are terribly high in the United States. None of us are a fan of that. And so actually students who have 2 years of undergraduate work toward their bachelor's apply for the program and receive free tuition to learn how to farm for the last 2 years of their college experience in Kentucky with the Berry Center. So it's a really unusual program that's out there. So where 12 students come in each year and are trained in the specifics. And part of the beauty of that is really taking the Sterling curriculum and embedding it in the Kentucky landscape and Kentucky culture, and also the Kentucky economy, as they try to shift away from so many of the kind of big ag practices that have predominated so much of that part of the country. And then as I came in to head up the School of the New American Farmstead, and that is a place, I think one of the closest complements I've seen to it in the UK is, I believe it's the School for Artisan Foods, which has a wonderful website. It's been a place I go to fairly frequently and look at that. And so what we're really trying to do is take the best of how things were done and the best of the cutting edge technologies and ideas for sustainable or regenerative, resilient farming and also food practices, and put those forward and educate students for those students being non-traditional students, continuing education primarily. And so that program is in its 4th year. Obviously, it's been very hands-on. So the pandemic sort of really threw us for a bit of a loop, in trying to figure out exactly what to do there when we typically bring people in, excuse me, bring them in from all over the world in order to learn these hands-on these crafts, these artisan food and farming crafts, and do that in a hands-on setting. Fortunately, as Phil and Rupa know, we also, March 1st, we were incredibly fortunate to receive a grant for $1.5 million to launch a new online educational platform dedicated to what we're calling regenerative communities that are really based on good, sustainable, resilient, regenerative food and farming practices. So those courses will be available worldwide, and we're actually gifting them to 5 communities around the world: in India, Bhutan, Puerto Rico, UK, we're still in conversations, and then also here in Vermont and Kentucky. So, I'm just incredibly lucky to be here in Vermont. As I said, I heard one person describe Wales as the Vermont of the UK at one point. You'd know better if that fits or not, but Vermont was the birthplace of the National Organic Standards for the United States, has the highest per capita and maybe not dollar-wise now, but has the highest number of organic farmers of any state in the country. And we also, 11 years ago, it really goes back about 12 years ago, we here in Vermont embarked on a process in which we created the first strategic plan for food systems in the United States of any state. At that point, we were consuming between 4 and 5% kind of local food, that is food that was produced in Vermont. We put forward this plan. It brought together philanthropists, legislators, policymakers, educators, folks who were working in the charitable food system, distributors, literally everyone from across the entire food system spectrum, brought those people together. And so now, as we just finished up our 10th year, entering the 11th, we're now rewriting the new plan for the next 10 years, and we're at 14%, which is pretty extraordinary. It's we were already at 5%. We were beyond anywhere in the United States. And now we're beyond anywhere in the United States by far at this point in time. So it's really sort of this living laboratory for, by whatever name, organic, sustainable, regenerative farming practices with an emphasis on local. The other thing that we did that struck me as interesting, and I put in a link for you to look. We're also the first state in the United States to have a food composting law, which just went into effect a couple of months ago. It's called Act 148. I put the link in there for you. So no longer can consumers or households, restaurants, institutions, no longer can we have food waste go into the regular waste stream. It has to be diverted, and it has to be composted or put into a biodigester. It has to be utilized in some aspect. In other words, really what we're talking about is a full soil-to-soil food system, which is something that it was actually here in Vermont that I first heard that phrase. And when you're thinking about a food system, that's a fairly extraordinary step to take. So, I'm really proud of Vermont at the same time, and I'm happy to talk about this as we go along. This is not easy work. There are struggles, we're tripping up in all kinds of different unexpected ways at various points. But it's been a really extraordinary journey for all of us who are here, who are paying attention and being involved in some form or fashion. So part of it is to say there is hope. Certainly doing this at the local level is absolutely critical. That's where this all got started. the reason that it started here was because we ended up having so many locales in Vermont that were trying to get food hubs going, that were trying to build up their farmers markets, that were trying to do food security issues and initiatives. And finally, it was the philanthropist in the States who said, you know, you've got to stop. And, you know, basically what you're doing is everybody is doing things, you know, that are really great, but you're not doing it together. And if it's not synchronized, then it's not going to work. And we're not going to fund anything except for a convening of all of the players who want to come in the state. And so they did that 11 years ago in Rutland, which is the town near me in the middle of Vermont, brought together over 350 stakeholders from the governor all the way down. And that's where things kicked off and started. So I'd encourage you to look at it, at the state plan. And in the, since then, this has gone on in other places. And Virginia, I've given you some assets from Virginia that are very interesting as well. New Mexico, California, Michigan, various places have also embarked on similar initiatives. But what's also happening now that I'll speak to at the very end is we're actually now getting the states of the Northeast to work together at sort of this meta level in order to coordinate this further. And because really what we've done now, I think in many ways, we've kind of saturated the local markets to a certain degree. I want to be careful how I say that. But, you know, when you've got a state of 700 and, well, you know, about 700,000 people, you reach a point somewhere where all of a sudden the local purchasing is only going to take you so far. And so in my view, personal view, right now what we have to be able to do is tap into agritourism as one piece and also the urban markets as another. And we have an urban base of 49 million people within a 4-hour drive. So those markets haven't been saturated. They've really been taken over by national and international agribusiness. So that's what we're up against now and part of what we're trying to do. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that struck me as I read through the plan and then have some discussion. One of the first things is something that I actually learned from some of your colleagues there in the UK that might be of interest. As you talk about, you know, as I look through your vision, you obviously biodiversity is something you were very interested in pursuing. And it was actually, I don't know if folks are familiar, you can nod if you are or not, with the Pesticide Action Network UK. Does that ring a bell? Fantastic group. And I'm blanking on Nick's last name, who's the policy advisor, is really wonderful. And Nick and I, off to the side, because of the book that I wrote, A Precautionary Tale about a small town in Italy that had a public referendum to ban all synthetic pesticides, I got to know Nick and we've met together several times. And we had this debate about whether it made sense to really exert a lot of time and energy focused on urban areas and suburban areas in terms of, non-synthetic, in terms of trying to get those communities to go organic in their landscaping and their playgrounds and other places. And what Pan UK decided to do, which I've also found has been replicated here in the United States several times, is to go ahead and deal with the environments that the majority of the consumers are most familiar with. You know, that's their lawns, their gardens, their public playgrounds, the different spaces around buildings, public buildings, around sidewalks, and tackle that. And they really see that as a way of channeling the interest and the focus, first of all, raising the awareness, but then channeling that interest into food by virtue of really sort of their most primary initial environmental contacts, those being the lawns and those public spaces. And so, you know, as you're thinking about biodiversity, Pan UK is a fantastic resource, and I think their strategy has been very interesting in trying to get people to think differently about those landscapes. And if you start delving into just the very basics of herbicides, then you find yourself going into these bigger agricultural picture of the fungicides, arachnicides, and all the other sides, that is those things of death that we dare not speak of, and the names that we can seldom pronounce, you know, when they come out as some of the chemical formulations. So that's, I think, a really interesting place to look. And then, let's see, I'm moving through, so hopefully it makes sense in terms of some of the links that I provided you. I think you really started an interesting process, and there's so many fascinating ways to go in terms of the visioning and thinking about how it is that you might do your asset mapping and planning. And one of the things in doing the research for rebuilding the food shed, one of the things that I learned right away was that it's really critical, obviously, to understand what those assets are. You started to do that, obviously, in the process of what you have there, and thinking about a whole food system, not just the farms, but obviously you're also thinking about, you know, the different aspects. And when we talk about food systems in academia, we're typically talking about, number one, places of aggregation. Where do you bring different products together? You know, and then thinking about the storage possibilities and bringing those things together. And these are really food hubs is sort of what we're doing under that one big roof very often. You know, the next piece is the distribution. And then obviously you've got the end of the kind of the food chain that goes to consumer, retail, wholesale, wherever that might go. So I think it's really interesting to start mapping those assets. I gave you a couple of examples, but one of the things that I think is really powerful, and actually, you know, this has been sort of a colonialistic practice in the past, so I don't want to suggest that I'm you know, advocating for that. But typically when you name it, you claim it, or when you put a name to it. And so as soon as you start to put things into visuals, you put things into a map, then suddenly people's imaginations start to galvanize around that. And I think that's a really important piece of this whole process. And one of the beauties right now of the digital era is there's so many fun ways to put those maps together. You can obviously do it by way of Google Maps. That's what a lot of organizations tend to do. You know, for a database, that's fine. For kind of capturing the public's imagination, it's not so pretty necessarily. I gave you one example of a story map. And so my friend John Van Hoosen and I are always comparing how we use mapping in food systems. And so you know, story maps are fascinating. And so if you get a chance to go in and look at the story maps with ArcGIS and JSTOR and some of these other places, you start to see how you can link, for example, taking all the farms, you can have a photo of the farm, you can have the farm story, you have its location. So as you're scanning across a map, for example, of new mills, all of the different parts of the food system start to pop up and you find ways to tell the story. And John calls all of these new digital tools that may or may not rely on GIS, you know, a more formalized system, but he calls these neo-geography. So I would really encourage you to utilize those skills of neo-geography, you know, both to sort of prick your own imaginations, and it also helps you with the asset piece and ultimately builds you toward that storytelling part, because you've got to tell the narrative to get people to buy in, literally and figuratively in many ways. So I think that's a fascinating approach kind of at the stage where it seems that you are right now. And then, you know, to take it a couple of steps further, they're also right now, one of the things you may see emerging, and it's being used by the agribusiness, agri-food business sector, but also by a lot of citizens groups and consumer groups, and that is blockchain technology. So, you know, we now have this ability really to capture a product at the very beginning, that is at the farm. We can even embed some of the details of how that farm is operating, in terms of, for example, you could include its soil analysis to give you a sense of, you know, what they look like in terms of the soil quality. That can be tracked over time in ways that that information can go directly to consumers by having this blockchain approach in which and some of this is really sophisticated and some of it is much less sophisticated, in which the products are being tracked, or at least the story of the product from the farm to wherever it is, you know, is actually there. And that can be done on a community scale. It doesn't always have to be something that involves, you know, a software developer doing it. In fact, there are quite a few software developers who've already done that. If you get really interested in that, one of the things that I did not put in here as a link is Food Plus Tech Connect, which is Danielle Gould is the person who's running that. And she always offers these very interesting insights and stories on how we can use some of this modern technology really to start to level the playing field. Because, you know, in many cases, these efforts that we're embarked upon are really have our kind of backs up against the wall in terms of the larger food interest in many cases. And then when it comes to energy and distribution. And you'll have to tell me, if this feels realistic to you or not. But one of the really interesting projects that's happening right around me that I'm involved with, and my wife is also working for this particular group right now. It's called the Regenerative Food Network. The website is under construction. But here's the idea, and this is why it perhaps has some application to new mills. So here there are two folks who are working with us very closely, heading up the Regenerative Food Network, and that's Kyle and Michael Philip. And Michael just recently moved to our area. He was in the Surviving the Future course. You may have seen him here and there, Phil. But a really interesting person who he came in after a banking career, actually lived in London for 6 years, ended up his career as being the working for Credit Suisse. He was the head of Credit Suisse branches in Europe, the Mideast, and Africa. And a really interesting and also highly ethical person who was doing his best in the banking industry to make sure the rest of the industry was following suit. But Michael had this idea as he came in from the financial world, realized that in order to change food systems, that we really had to bring in more finances. As I talked about Vermont, we're happy when we get a couple $100,000 or $1 million in order to do something for our food systems. But that's not that big a lever in the whole scheme of things. And so what Michael and Kyle have brought forward is this ability to bring in financing that are investments typically that come from pension funds that have to be utilized, some percentage has to be utilized for sustainable practices, sustainable businesses. And that there's more money to be invested in energy and transportation, at least here in the United States, than there is in food and agriculture. So the idea is to try to set up a distribution system in which we're using electric vehicles. Those electric vehicles are serving multiple purposes. First of all, obviously, they're involved in the distribution system. And right now, cargo vans are very readily available here in the United States, or at least I should say, becoming more readily available. Box trucks are about to come online, and then the big lorries are probably 2023 to 2025 before those appear. So the idea is to set up a distribution network that is based on e-vehicles, but that also has some other pluses to it. This is tied to solar systems. So one of the things that Kyle has done in Atlanta has been working on a project to cover parking lots with solar panels. So to provide the shading, but then also to have a fleet of rental vehicles that are associated with that for the average person who doesn't want to have to own a car. And not only is that providing service in terms of e-vehicles, it's also providing a storage mechanism for the solar array, because obviously the sun is coming down at certain peak periods. He's storing that energy, feeding that back into the grid, and then also selling it back. So they're covering the parking lots, and they're doing that on a 30-year rental basis. And so then they actually sell that energy back at a cheaper rate to those places like around here, these big Home Depots and shopping centers and other places that might have it. So certainly looking at new mills, part of what I had to wonder was, is there the possibility for, and I saw that you have this there already in the plan in some ways, what are the possibilities in terms of setting up a distribution network, in which it's phased, in which you're able to find investment money for the distribution system. And part of the problem here is that our distribution system throughout the United States is so centralized that in order to get farmers to be able to sell local food, we have to find new ways to sort of break apart that distribution system and be able to do it in such a way that it's not built on the farmers' backs, or more appropriately on the farmers' wallets, because farmers are paying about 35 cents on the dollar for the distribution. So in other words, is there a way of utilizing all the benefits of these renewable energy systems to bring that cost down, because the profit starts to move into the energy and transportation sector, and so you can actually start to reduce the cost to the farmer for the distribution in some ways. So it's been a really interesting concept, and we're also actually looking at putting these charging stations on different farms in the region, so that it's more of a kind of disentangled web in some ways, that where the farmers can be the farmers and the distributors, or they can be sort of these food hubs for other farmers in their immediate area. So there are all kinds of iterations, but this is part of what's at play here right now. I then also wanted to mention food hub models. You're thinking about food hub, that came out, and it's an interesting topic. It's fascinating, and I gave you some pieces of what's happening here. I mean, one place where I've seen it be highly successful is sort of in my backyard. We have some farmers who, I guess about 10, almost 12 years ago, set up the first winter farmers market in Vermont. It was the first farmers market in Vermont, of all places, to go 52 weeks out of the year. The sort of the amazing capacity of the farmers and the stick-to-itiveness of the consumers was astounding, because for 3 years that was in an unheated space in Vermont throughout the winter. And it worked. And it gave all of these farmers this ability not to have to shut down in the winter, but really to keep the income streams coming throughout the year. And so gradually over time, a friend of mine, Greg Cox, and other farmers, they came together. They got an old warehouse that was a lumber supply company that had been abandoned. That they got that warehouse and turned it into a heated winter farmers market. And now it's generating over $2.5 million every winter, which is just extraordinary. And what's really neat, there's solar panels that are there. It's also heated in part, and they're going 100% with renewable energy with these grass pucks, and also with wood and brush cuttings. So we're really innovative, and the possibilities are there. As you're thinking about it, it's certainly, there are a lot of successes in the United States with food hubs, and there are also a number of failures. And so I think it's good to go into that conversation kind of eyes wide open. Some of the models here are ones that make sense and some don't. We all get excited about it because it's such a great concept of putting all of this stuff under one roof and having it be a community center, an education center, an economic tool, and it can work. But I would go in with your eyes wide open, as you're doing that. There actually is, it's online now, there is a food hub education certificate program, a management program, which is at the University of Vermont. I've been a guest speaker there a couple of times. I've been so impressed with the people in that certificate program. So if it is something that you decide to pursue, it may be well worth your while to have someone from New Mills engage in that certificate program. I can really assure you it's of the highest quality. There's no other program like it in the United States. It's expanded into Canada. And there's a lot of brain power and savvy that's in every cohort that goes through that particular program. So since it's online now, that may be something that's of interest. And then two more things. One is, it sounds like you're sort of potentially moving toward the development of trying to formalize what it is you do and how you operate. And I'm not sure if the kind of concept of food policy councils have kind of sprung up in the UK or not. It's big in the United States and in Canada. And again, these are like food hubs. Sometimes they're highly successful, and sometimes they fail within 2, 3, 4 years. But the idea is to start to impact local and regional policy by virtue of having these food policy councils created, typically by some sort of legal statute, so that they have some power to them. Sometimes they're advisory to a mayor or to a borough, to some other group. So it's a really interesting model. And Mark Winnie is one of the folks who's done the most work on food policy councils in the U.S. and Canada. So I gave you his manual that he put forward on how to develop a food council and different models, and what folks are doing that might be of interest. And then also finally just wanted to bring out the notion of agritourism, and certainly kind of Googling around, and I'm sure this is something you've thought of. But the area in which I lived and farmed and have been going back since 1983 is the Alto Adige or Südtirol, the South Tyrol region of Italy, autonomous province there, which went from being one of the poorest, if not the poorest province in all of Italy, to being the wealthiest. And a lot of that was because of agritourism. So the link that I gave you, they've actually created a Center for Agritourism And ironically, we were supposed to have the second conference for the agritourism group, which is sponsored out of URAC, out of Bolzano, Italy. It was supposed to be here in Vermont in October. That's been canceled. But, you know, I think the agritourism model is something that's well worth looking at. I also noticed that people are very interested in cycling. I think there was even mention of e-bikes. The South Tyrol region is a fascinating place to look at how they've combined tourism and food and farming and cycling and hiking. You know, all of these pieces are there in a really fascinating way. So as you're thinking about assets and thinking about mapping, that's something that you might want to be thinking about as well. And one other thing that I was going to mention as well, it may be happening there. It was sort of a new phenomena that popped up here in the United States. Well, a very old biblical, I guess, phenomena, as some people would put it, talking about gleaning. And, you know, farmers' fields, after they've done the primary harvest, having typically community volunteers. Sometimes here they're actually AmeriCorps workers. So generally young people who are being paid for their service for a year, who go out and do gleaning of the fields after the farmers have done their first or last primary harvest, and going in and picking up the residuals. And then those go into the charitable food system. I don't know if there's opportunity, room, or interest for that, but that's been something that actually has really taken hold and been very powerful. And it ends up not just being a food security piece, but it ends up being a very powerful educational tool, because those, for example, AmeriCorps workers and volunteers very often end up being people who then find their way into other aspects of the food system, and doing that on a more professional basis or a more extended voluntary basis. So I just, you know, I'll wrap up by saying, you know, I just really commend you for everything you've done, the thinking you've put in so far, the creativity, and it's clear that you've got the moxie, as some would say here. That's all there, and it's just exciting to see where you're at, and curious to see where you might go. So I'll, you know, leave it open for questions, comments, critiques, whatever might come.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Philip. That's really interesting to hear your perspective on that. And I think one of the last things you were saying about sort of pulling things together in terms of the food, farming, cycling, and all the different aspects of things that came through from the community conversation is one thing that we really want to try and do as much as possible, is to keep all those different aspects of the vision coming together and trying to kind of work together, all those things. So I will open the floor to questions. If anybody would like to put their cameras on, they're more than welcome. If you have a question or a comment or anything, you can put your hand up, give me a wave, or just Phil, of course. I'll pass on to you first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. Wow, there was I think there were so many different threads there that it's going to take a while for us all to kind of work through the document. So thank you. And the more opportunities and the more, you know, the more possibilities, then the greater it is for all of us. There was a few things I just wanted to pick up on. We kind of, where we live in the UK in Derbyshire is typically farming country. And I believe that we've farmed in Derbyshire for 4,000 years. But our relationship with our farmers is not great in terms of our community and our farms. And when you read about the history of New Mills, at one point the relationship was very close, because these were the people who fed us. These were really important people. You know, they were at the heart of our community, and now that relationship is just not there anymore. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on how we go about trying to fix that relationship, so that we bring the people who produce food back into the center of our communities again. And it works both ways. I think there's a real, you know, it's a two-way breakdown. You know, we don't speak to our farmers and they don't speak to us very much at all. And I'm wondering whether you know, you've had experience of that in Vermont. And if so, how did you start to mend that relationship with the people who make our food?
It's a great question, and sort of a tragedy and travesty I think we all face at this point, Phil, in so many ways. You know, I think one of the most important aspects at the very beginning is to emphasize, you know, local and community before we start having the other conversations about organic, sustainable, regenerative, resilient, these other pieces. That first we have to sort of reweave those threads of community and get that going. And people like me, I think we have to check ourselves on language that's very polarizing at the very beginning. You know, I think that's one of the challenges sometimes is, you know, so many of us who maybe consider ourselves to sort of be in a progressive camp or by whatever name, that we use words, and I used agribusiness, I think, in this case, or we talk about industrial ag, or, you know, there's certain phrases that, you know, here in the US, we talk about big ag all the time, corporate farming, you know. So I think we have to be careful of language and find ways to reconnect and bring people together. One of the models I just love that I ran into, unfortunately, you know, you write a book and then afterwards you find out all the things you wish you'd known before you wrote the book. So the darn book tour ought to be flopped around so you get to do that first. But you know, I went to Athens, Ohio, and Athens is a place, is a fairly small town, a college town. I think about 30,000 people when the college folks are there. But it has the back to the landers who moved in the 60s, 70s. It has the conventional farmers, and then it has the Amish and the Mennonite farmers, and then it has kind of the newer organic farmers. And so a highly diverse mix. And the place where they all meet is at the community produce auction, which I think is every Thursday, late afternoon, early evening, where all of those farmers come in to basically a shed, much like this one, where they come in, they bring their produce. It's aggregated in some cases, or it's by farm. And then the chefs, the restaurateurs, consumers, other people come in and do the bidding on the larger quantities or buying the smaller quantities as individual consumers. And, you know, and talking to the people there, that's just the place where sort of all the facades drop. The food is there, you know, but then the conversations go a bit further. So I thought that was one of the most brilliant kind of moves I saw. I think one of the other ways that, you know, is perhaps important if you're thinking about, I mean, we all want to differentiate, you know, how food is produced, you know, in terms of what we're kind of taking into our communities, our stores, and our bodies. But at the same time, allowing farmers the opportunity, you know, to transition, for lack of a better word, or because there is no better word, you know, but allowing farmers to transition into actually, you know, better food practices, I think is a really important piece. So not having them feel like, you know, this world just does not make sense. This is, you know, these are those people and these are my people. And the other thing is, you know, farmers follow the money. And I don't mean that as a crass statement. I mean, we're all as farmers trying to find ways to make a living and do it reasonably well. And, you know, I haven't been anywhere in the world where it is easy to do that. So whenever we're providing opportunities for farmers to have a better income, it's all the better. In the United States right now, farmers get, on average, of every food dollar, farmers only get 16 cents on the dollar. So, and I don't know what it is in the UK, I'd be really curious, but when you can change that dynamic so that farmers are getting 40, 50, 60% or 100, man, all the better. I mean, that will probably get you somewhere faster than just about anything else, you know, from the farmer side.
Right. Esther, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the language that you're using, Philip, and I think it's a big divide between the people who are passionate about sustainability and local economies and new economies, and using language that actively excludes people who feel that financially they don't have a choice with their food. And we're quite lucky that in a relatively small borough area, we've got 2 independent abattoirs that kill meat from local farmers. So the food miles are really low, the carbon footprint's very low. The obviously, if you're going to pay that extra to go to an independent abattoir, your animal husbandry standards are probably higher.
Yeah.
In the States, do you have, are there such things still as independent abattoirs, or does everything have to go to these massive factory things where you just become disconnected from the land and the you know, where the animals are reared?
It's a great question, Esther. I mean, we're incredibly fortunate in Vermont. You know, we have a number of still small independent abattoirs, and you know, also that are USDA certified, which is really important for someone like myself. I use an abattoir that is about a 45-minute drive from here, and they're fantastic. I mean, you know, they're as close as high up, I think, as you can really get in terms of the ethics and just the quality and the food safety piece. So that's still there. I mean, it was interesting. I actually ran into an issue a couple of weeks ago when I sent an animal. As I mentioned early on, I have American Milking Devon cattle, and a breed standard is that they have their horns. You know, so my whole herd has horns, which isn't really the case for most farmers who have beef here in the U.S. And so now there's a question the USDA is beginning to talk about, actually, in fact, my abattoir, not because of my animal, but someone else's, they threatened to shut them down because the animals had horns, and well, they probably let them congregate at some point and they were attacking each other. But, you know, at least I have a relationship with the owner of the abattoir, so that we had that conversation, as tense as it was. He would say, you need to get rid of all the horns on all of your animals. And like, I can't quite do that, but I do have that relationship. So we're really lucky here. And you're absolutely right about the language. I buy my hay from, you know, and again, I don't even like the word conventional, from a conventional dairy farmer. And, you know, I think we have to embed ourselves in the communities and find that middle ground, you know, that knits us together in various ways. A campus pastor in college said to me, the quote from his grandmother that stuck with him more than any was, you can judge the character of a person by the integrity of their compromises. And I'm not one for remembering quotes, but that was a quote that really stuck with me. You know, it is the integrity that compromises, because if there is no compromise, there's very often no conversation, you know, which doesn't get us anywhere in terms of community either.
And how do you feel your work fits with move to more plant-based eating? I personally, I feel that there are a lot of people who are ethical vegans who maybe don't understand enough about farming and are looking at a picture that doesn't relate particularly to sort of a high peak farming category, where our animals are usually out in the fields all the time.
Right.
In the States, do you get a lot of conflict? That may says it all. How do you get your right? Obviously, you've got it. So, what language can you use to encourage people to distinguish between bad practices overall and good local practices that should be sustained and encouraged without anybody feeling guilty?
Yeah. Well, if you Google me and Google my name and animal rights and New York Times or Boston Globe or NPR or it's Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, you'll find me there in the middle of an animal rights campaign about 12 years ago that was incredibly intense. I mean, it was about the most traumatic thing I've ever encountered in my entire life. By virtue of just quick background, so it gives a little bit of context, the college farm that I started, we had 2 oxen that were 10 years old. One of them had an ankle injury. We decided that it was time to put him down. We felt like that it made more, well, we actually had a public meeting at the college in which all the students were invited to participate, which was run by a vegetarian, in which we basically had a consensus-based meeting to decide whether to send him to slaughter and bring him into the dining hall and provide about 1/4 of the beef that was purchased there anyway, or whether to send him, or, you know, we could have euthanized him and we could have sent him to a farm sanctuary. And that erupted nationally and became quite the story. And for about 6 months, I mean, to the point, there was one 24-hour period, we had 4.2 million emails came through this tiny little college, and, you know, death threats. They came to my home farm. So I've seen the darker side, and at the same time, I studied animal rights in college. I've always been really interested in it. You know, decided obviously I was eventually came to this point of having my animals slaughtered, in some cases slaughtering them on the home farm. So and when I lead study tours back to the South Tyrol, I go with one of the leading vegan authors in the United States, Sharon Palmer, and we co-lead that tour because I really want I want to both have that dialogue and model that dialogue for others. I think there is middle ground, or at least there are ways to have common understanding. And folks like Sharon, she lives in California. She doesn't have to eat meat. You know, there's the farmers markets she goes to are just extraordinary. In fact, the book she's writing now is on being vegan in California and all the different possibilities. But it is a real challenge, and actually it's a British fellow, Andrew Gunther, is one of the leading spokespersons here in the United States for animal welfare with the AWA Animal Welfare Association. British, came to the United States, married an American. He's an interesting person to look up. Andrew has been doing a lot of work trying to promote this dialogue between folks who I guess it comes down to the perspective very often of, I have no issue when folks are promoting animal rights. It's the way in which they're promoted sometimes where there's not a tolerance. And in some cases, like here in Vermont, hilly Vermont, it's really hard to produce a lot of vegetables in a landscape like this. And there are real questions about whether it's ecologically appropriate to do that as opposed to grazing animals. That whole question of whether we want to take an animal's life into our own hands is something bigger and broader. But Andrew and others have been doing a really good job trying to get the word out of the reason the animal rights attack came to Green Mountain College, where I was working at the time, was because there was a desire among some of the more militant animal rights activists to find a farm that they could attack that was promoting sustainability, because they did not like, quote unquote, happy meat and happy milk. They didn't want that image or that idea. And they also didn't want to attack a small farm. So instead they came to a small college. So it ended up, it certainly opened my eyes quite a bit to this whole dialogue and just how critical it is. I mean, I'm glad you're bringing it out. And I hope we can keep those conversations going because they're so important. So I don't mind where people land. And I think it's important to remember sometimes we also land at different ethical choices at different points in our lives. I mean, my wife was a vegetarian when I met her. Then pregnancy, she hit some anemia issues, and our farm right beside us was producing beef, right off the farm. We knew how it was killed, how it was raised, how it was killed, how it was processed. And so she decided to start eating meat again at that point. So I just wish there were more tolerance and mutual respect. And the respect has to go both ways. There are also folks like myself. We have to be willing and open to listen and have the conversation. That was a long-winded response, Esther. I'm sorry.
It's been recorded for my thesis.
Okay. I'm in 2 other books if you want to find those online, and they're not pretty. I hope your thesis is nicer to me.
I think they will be. Has anybody got any other questions I'd like to add? Is anybody else? Phil, I'll go back to you. Thinking caps on anybody else? Yeah, Phil. Oh,
I've got loads of questions.
I think Andrew might be. Have you got your hand up, Andrew? Sorry.
Yep.
Phil's already had.
Phil's already had one question.
Go on, Andrew. Yeah, please.
No, it's simple, Philip. I'm an accountant, and I'm trying to persuade local farmers at the moment to work together and set up farmers' shops or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, interesting question. Did the price of food increase or decrease? And why did it go up, and why shouldn't it have gone down from farmers? Because the margins are much higher, even though the overheads are there. With the reasonable amount of volume, they should make more profit, a lot more profit.
So are you asking specifically about the case in Vermont, Andrew?
Yeah. I think it's a general principle. I don't think it's, what was their attitude? You could argue UK farmers are different from the US farmers. They may not be.
Sure. I guess the thing that probably is the same, Andrew, is that direct farmer to consumer, relationship. And when you cut the middle out, and that middle involves so many things, or at least cut so much of that middle out, it's just inevitable that farmers are going to do better. The prices may or may not have to be different. I think it's a conscious choice that we all have to make about, on one hand, there's added value by virtue of value added products. And so we're all trying to differentiate. For myself, for example, when I price my beef, I try to make sure that someone of sort of the moderate income level that my family has can afford it. Others around me go to literally 6 miles down the road to the next village, where it's, the millionaires are just about the only people who live there. Those prices are totally skewed from the market that's 8 or 10 miles away. And I don't begrudge the farmers, who ask those higher prices. But I think it's a balancing act that we all have to kind of figure out for ourselves. It is here in the States, for example, if you're organic certified, I would say what I see in the different markets, it's usually a 25 to a 50% premium for organic. In the Alto Adige and the South Tyrol, it tends to be more a 10 to 15% margin. For myself, I'm just more comfortable with that because I feel like we provide the opportunity. I don't like when there's the discrimination in terms of a consumer's ability to purchase.
I think the point really is if the farmers want the business and they want the volume, and that volume can be 90% if they have the capacity, they're going to have to reduce the prices. So the question really is, are their prices still higher than the supermarkets or similar?
There's it's interesting too in terms of what they're growing and what they're selling. This doesn't exactly apply to the UK perhaps, but there's a woman, Linda Watson, who is in Raleigh, North Carolina. She did an analysis for people here who are on food stamps or the EBT program. This is for folks who are on some sort of food assistance programs. She actually went in and she did a study in looking at what you would pay in the supermarket versus what you would pay at the farmers markets and cooperatives if you're buying conventional food, if you're buying food that's organic, or in food that's local. And she actually, by virtue of the recipes, she figured out ways that everyone could be able to purchase organic and very often locally produced food, within that super ridiculously tight threshold. But it's based on cooking, and I think you all brought that out already. It's it's also that interface between not just the farmer and the consumer, but between the consumer and the kitchen. And if that's totally degraded, then which it is, in many cases, then we've got more work to do in that regard.
True. So is there a real premium for organic food in the US then? To a certain extent, in principle, I don't actually agree with it. How sophisticated is it? How easy is it to become an organic farmer in the US?
I think it's complex. It's not an easy hurdle. I appreciate a lot of the standards that are there. Some people feel like it's too big a hurdle. Other people feel like the standards have been too watered down. You'll get a lot of different responses to it here. But, if you go through the checklist of the inspector, the organic inspector, when that person comes to the farm, you've got a hell of a lot of record keeping that you had to do. You've got things that have to be demonstrated at any point in time, that you're within the regs. And it is expensive, but in many cases there are programs that are provided by the individual states or the federal government or a combination to help offset those costs.
Right. No, good.
Really great questions.
It's just a restricted market, isn't it? It's, by all the rules, it creates an extra value and a cost and profit and excludes people who can't really afford it. And in the UK at the moment, with the present government, there'll be no subsidies in terms of that. So the wealthy, the rich, the middle class, whatever, can afford it. And then the more vulnerable groups, whatever they may be, can't.
Yep.
So it depends on the state.
Yep. And I think it varies by product too. For example, I think annual crops are the easiest to do organic because you can utilize crop rotations and other things to minimize pest and disease. Perennial crops like orchards, vineyards are, in my view, the most complex. Livestock is somewhere in the middle. Sometimes it's really easy with livestock if you don't have many parasite issues. That one's not hard. But if you've got parasite issues or high density of animals in a given space, you're making it hard on yourself in that regard very often.
Right. So, okay. Thank you, Philip. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Andrew.
So I know Phil had a question and Esther has her hand up. Whose is most related to what we're talking about? I have a feeling it might be.
I can't tell you.
There was a reason. The reason why I asked that question. She was jumping at the bit, so I thought I haven't forgot you, Phil. So
yeah.
I'm just thinking about what you were saying earlier and just now about that link between cooking and eating. And cost control and awareness. I'm wondering, I mean, it's a long time since I've been to the States. In the normal bits of the United States, are people cooking from scratch more as a result of COVID forcing them to be more local? Or, because in my head, it's been quite a cooking culture that's quite reliant on at least semi-processed foods for a lot of people, particularly if you're on low incomes. And I was wondering whether that has changed recently, or as the divide got bigger, or has it got smaller, or are people being more confident to try and cook from scratch?
Yeah, no, it's a super question, Esther. And so my perception, again, it could be a little too Vermont based, but also watching the national media, there's no question but that people are in the kitchen much, much more. They're in experimenting mode, dealing with ennui, and trying to, utilize it. Baking, went through the roof. Be that a good thing or not, I don't know. But, that certainly was re-inspired. But at the same time, there was a report recently that processed food sales have also gone up dramatically. So, I don't know how it all balances out. In the end, my suspicion, unfortunately, is those who've been most disenfranchised and marginalized economically, socially, and other ways are probably the ones who've had a harder time, kind of having the time, the resources, the money to jump back in with the cooking. The joy of what I see is when I go into the local hardware stores and agricultural supply stores, you can't buy a seed unless it's arugula. I mean, people, it is gone. Seeds are not there, and that's amazing. The gardening and the backyard poultry piece has just gone through the roof here in the States, which is awesome. But I fear it's probably not equitable. On the other hand, having grown up down in North Carolina, the southern part of the U.S., hunting and fishing are something that have been kind of ignored by the local food advocates. And I think that's a class issue, a classist issue, because hunting and fishing are so much a part of that culture. A lot of Western, throughout the United States, that's been part and parcel. That's picking up, I think, both the hunting and the fishing, both as recreation and food. So that piece feels like maybe that's been lifted up some as well, which could be a boon. Yeah, but really good question. Let's hope.
I'm going to be really cheeky, Phil, and just pop in a question before I come back to you. I was just wondering if you can think of anything we can do to try and keep the changes that have happened during COVID, trying to maintain them. If there's any, like you say, I fear that things will return, but is there anything that you're aware of that people are doing that could act to support people to continue to do some of the practices that are beneficial?
That's a really good question, Penny. It seems like the more, while the pressure is on us, the more we can help people be successful, in the kitchen, in the garden, in the grocery store, or getting them out of the grocery store and getting them to other places. The more we can help them find success instead of frustration, that seems to be really critical, to me, and trying to somehow keep that alive. I hope that part and parcel of this is also the kind of reclaiming of the table. I know that also happened in my family. My 10-year-old daughter, she said about 2 months ago, I love COVID, meaning that we all eat together every single night. And that I think we maybe it's not as precarious as we think if we've sort of, again, tightened up those strands a little bit on the family level. No, but and that's not really an adequate. None of those are adequate responses because they're also fragile and tenuous, I think.
I guess talking about it though, and actually just talking about our experiences and making people recognize that what they've gained from this experience might help to keep that all alive, as well as finding ways to support it.
Yeah.
I see Liz has got a hand up, but I'm going to go to Phil first, just because I've been putting him off for ages. Can you remember what you wanted to say, Phil?
Actually, yeah. You mentioned, Philip, you mentioned the word story a few times when you were kind of opening up. And I'm wondering what the importance of story and narrative is, and who writes that story? How does it come together? One of the things that we did with our community conversation was to start that conversation. Our town had never come together in any way to have this conversation. And the idea, as with the conversation, we continue having this conversation, and we hope that a story and a narrative comes out of the process itself. But I'm just wondering, in terms of rebuilding, our food shed of regenerative food culture, how important is there to be an overarching kind of narrative in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, it's a super question. I think story is second only to food, and whether we're going to sustain, these little victories that we get along the way, and it's a little more antagonistic or polarizing than I like to think of it, but there's an interesting book and a number in this vein called Story Wars, looking at advertising and, basically, I mean, one way of putting it is I think in many ways we've lost the story wars up to this point in terms of so many of the things that we care about, because the stories, the narrative, we've allowed again, words are problematic, but sort of the corporate domain. I mean, those who are, oftentimes perhaps a bit more greedy than they are, benevolent. We've allowed them to capture the narrative and advance that and put it forward, and we keep losing in that regard. When I talk to groups here in the U.S., I say, that the downside is here in the U.S. We've only captured at the most, by any measure, 5% of the market in terms of whatever you want to call it: local food, organic food, sustainable food, organic research. We've not broken the 5% threshold on any of it. On the other hand, the fastest growing food sector in the United States is organic. And so when you look at the trend lines, we are moving in in the right direction, but there's still good news and bad news is there's sort of 95% left. And I think a lot of that is story based. And so sometimes it's story, but sometimes it's using story in different ways. I'm intrigued, somewhat hopeful by some of these technologies and the ability to level the playing field, as I was talking about, of being able to have some of these apps and software that being developed that people have, of being able to translate the farm story, the farm realities, the farm products into things that consumers can buy with relative convenience. I mean, obviously, our world, people are still looking for that convenience, and you all are trying to figure it out with the food waste and food packaging. What expense does that convenience come? I think that's also really important. So yeah, I think it's a huge piece, and we do ourselves no good by not really paying attention to how that narrative is cast, and you don't get to do it once. It's constant. I mean, the corporate world's not doing it once; they're spinning it out over and over and over again, and we have to be willing to do the same. We do ourselves sometimes a disservice by the terms, as we have consumers so confused. I think the last number in the graduate course I taught a couple of years, the last number I have was there were 425 certifications for sustainable food globally. There are probably more than that right now. So on one hand, cool. Yeah. On the other hand, we're confusing consumers at the same time. And I don't have a good resolution to that. I don't really know what we do, but I think we need to be mindful of it. And I'm watching this now as folks like myself use the word regenerative more and more. Who's going to give the pitch for regenerative, and what that word means, and how long does it take for it to saturate the consumer consciousness? I think we finally got there with sustainability. We saturated the consciousness to the point that, everyone, Bayer, Monsanto, the whole agrochemical crew, they picked up on it and they're using it, to their own benefit. So at that point, you need to make another turn, but it's complex for the consumer. Yeah, but I think you all have done a beautiful job. I mean, I just, the way you started out, was magnificent with your book, and then also to be able to tell that on the web. And I think you and Rupa heard me say this before, my collaborator and friend who is much wiser in these things than I am, Douglas Gayton of the Lexicon of Sustainability. Two of the best lessons I've learned from him in our 10 years working together are, one, no information waste. So, no food waste, no information waste. And so you all did that. You grab every event, every story. You try to figure out how to tell that. Don't let those things disappear because they build on each other. And the other piece is platform agnostic. In order to reach the whole community, some people you're going to reach by their phones, some you're going to reach by pop-up art shows, some you're going to reach by a book or a podcast. So, don't allow information waste to happen, and try to avoid being so wedded to one platform that you disenfranchise various people in multiple audiences. And that gets at food justice, food sovereignty as well, helps, you have a better chance of bringing in a broader cross-section of the community, I think. Yeah.
Wise words. Yes, Liz. You're on mute.
Is that better?
It is.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I've been sitting listening to this and listening to the discussions about whether or not people can afford food and stuff from farm shops, and I know that a lot of local people here probably can't. But if there was more of it, surely it would become cheaper, because that idea of reduced transport costs, reduced packaging costs would become the economy of scale. Would that hold true? But I'm also thinking that people aren't only cash poor. A lot of families nowadays are time poor. They don't have time to shop like our parents used to do. For whatever reason there's myriad reasons why that might be. So I'm thinking, what model could you use that would solve that, and also start getting the messages about local food and sustainability and all the rest of it even more prevalent? And what about a model where a community owned its supermarket? And all the things that you couldn't get locally, the coffee, the tea, the rice, the pasta, the fish maybe, you bought as a supermarket bought, and everything that was local was purchased locally. And we have in the UK the Cooperative Society, which when it was born was local food cooperatives, wasn't it? That's what it was. So, is that a model that might work?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question and also critique, Liz, that I think it's one of the most fascinating conundrums we really face in all of this. And I especially appreciate your, recognizing, bring out the time poor piece as well as the money aspect. So for example, with Linda Watson, whom I mentioned earlier, the recipe she put forward, she was trying to do is cost effective, using as many raw ingredients as possible, and also a high convenience factor. And a lot of this is also about people learning to shop in the bulk section again, you know, and that takes some education. And so far, there are two places in the United States I've seen the best. These are the two best examples I've run into so far. One is the Decora co-op in Decorah, Iowa, which is not where you'd necessarily expect to find this in the Midwest with so much conventional farming. They have this amazing co-op there. And part of what they do is education, not just on purchasing bulk items. And this gets back also, you know, to the grains and the pulses and, you know, these things that are so healthy that are there, but they also do cooking lessons. And they also will provide discreetly, so you're not embarrassed, an employee to help you go through and figure out what to buy, how much to buy, how to cook it. And then to take that a step further, there's so Burlington, Vermont is the largest city in Vermont, and the grocery store, which was right in the middle of the city, the chain grocery store left. And so people put forward to the town council that they wanted there to be a co-op to replace the grocery store. And so relatively small footprint by kind of conventional grocery store space in the United States. And what the city council agreed to do was to allow the co-op to make the purchase and to support it. But there was also the requirement that I think it was either 30 or 35% of the food be conventional, quote unquote, conventional food that was at the normal kind of price points that people could afford. So the idea was to stream people in, allow them to be able to shop in the way that they found to be most effective. And that grocery store has been so incredibly effective that now they purchased another larger grocery store on the outside of town, because you can barely get in there sometimes, either by virtue of parking or the number of people. And so it is a cooperative. It's the Onion River Co-op. And I can send that link to you as well. They've just done an amazing job. And so the employees are required to give community time very often, and they're paid for that time, and that time that they do very often is in cooking classes and helping people do the shopping and the education. And so I've seen it be super effective, and actually in other places too, but those are the two places where it just feels like, all right, it really worked here, and not perfect, but it's about as close as I think we can get. You know, so that gives me hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to have those examples of what we could try and achieve to look at and learn from. Yeah. Is there any more questions? Oh, Phil, go on then, Phil.
Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about the role that art plays in community, in narrative, in food? How can art help us understand a pathway forward? I know that in your books you've talked about this previously, and I wonder if you give some examples of this idea of starting a conversation, this idea of building community. You know, where does art fit into all that, if it does at all? Yeah, no, it's such a a critical piece there. Again, maybe that's in the hierarchy, maybe art is the third by the time we get there. But I mean, food in and of itself is art, and agriculture is art. You know, I mean, in terms of landscape and what we tend to love. So I think it's already sort of art is indigenous to the food and agricultural space anyway. But in terms of kind of messaging, and again, and sort of the story wars, if we want to be that kind of dramatic about it, you know, art is what makes the difference. And, you know, a lot of the pushes for things that we may not wish for have been done, you know, artfully, maybe in a crass way. But you know, it's the art and activism that I find to be so interesting and intriguing in trying to open up people's minds, sort of burst the bubble of what we just accept as ordinary and a given, and sort of exploding the myths very often associated with the health of the natural environment and, you know, of humans themselves. So, you know, the story certainly of the town in Italy, the town of Maltz, or Malta Svenosta in Italian,
there it really was art, activism, and and women who were the ones who kind of cracked the code in terms of really raising the issue to the point of salience that people started paying attention. And they did amazing things of, first of all, one of maybe the biggest lesson I learned in trying to capture, well, first learn the story, capture and translate it, was positivity. And art in this case, in the food world, I think really allows us the opportunity to celebrate biodiversity, to celebrate agrobiodiversity, to celebrate, food table togetherness. All of those pieces can come together. And that's certainly one of the things that the women of Maltz really encouraged when they had this referendum. One of the things that, well, they did so many things using the arts. They wanted to emphasize what was happening with regard to pesticides. So the women one night got together in a barn that was just on the outskirts of the town center, and they got Tyvek pesticide suits, stuffed them full of hay, and then took the chemicals that were used for apples. And so each kind of straw man, as it were, each hay man had on his or her front, I don't know if they were gender neutral, I guess, but on the front had all of the danger warnings of everything to do with that particular pesticide. And then they placed these straw men all over the town, the center of town where the farmer's market appeared. They did this under the cover of darkness. And so in the morning, when people came out for the farmer's market, there were all these men that were scattered around. And that was really artfully done. And then they had a banner campaign. And those were all stenciled banners in which they, in the middle of the night, one night, they unveiled, I think it was about 300 of these banners from balconies and houses and gardens and guest houses and restaurants. They unrolled these, and the banners were really beautifully done, carefully stenciled. In the process of starting the stenciling, when they were all getting together, and this was sort of a covert activity at the beginning, as they were doing the stenciling, the beekeeper, Pia Oswald, Pia said, we cannot use the words, in German though, no, not, never, there can be no negativity. This has to be a positive campaign. And so we are not calling for a ban on pesticides, we're calling for a pesticide-free future. And so then it gave rise really to sort of what became the motif, which was the sunflower. And sunflower in the middle of it very often had "ja" painted in it, yes. So that the sunflower, the yes, the positivity, and sunflowers appeared in all sorts of places throughout the town and villages that they never should have. And the watering trough during the campaign, there would be sunflowers there. There were sunflowers painted on the pavement, very nice fashion that you would see throughout all of these 11 villages that were comprised as a municipality. And then certainly saw it with working with Douglas as we tried to tell the story of Maltz, again, as he was saying, we have to be platform agnostic. His notion was, and he'd done this successfully with the Lexicon of Sustainability, was not just for us to have a book, not just the presentations, not just the website, but to have a pop-up show. And so we created this pop-up show, which actually is boxed up behind me, that we've taken and shipped all over the world, which is 24 of the artworks that Douglas did, which you can see on topplinggoliath.org. If you go to topplinggoliath.com, you end up at the brewery, and that's okay too, but you won't have anything but a virtual beer there, and that's in Decorah, Iowa also. But if you go to topplinggoliath.org, you can see the story of Maltz, you can see all of the artworks that Douglas did. And for example, when we took that show to San Francisco, we took it to one of the largest farmers markets in the United States in front of the San Francisco ferry terminal. And I started setting it up, and Douglas came over and he's like, no, that's all wrong. I'm like, what? Well, we have these tripods. We have these in inches, 24 by 36, I guess something like, I won't convert it to centimeters at the moment, but 24 by 36 posters that we put up, 24 of them all around the farmer's market. But he said, you got to social engineer how people go through this pop-up art exhibit, because you want to have them stop at certain points, either to reflect or to bump into each other and engage in conversation, so that it's not just viewing, it's the social experience that you're creating. And so after that, I started being really conscious as we were taking these around different parts of the United States and Europe and India, just so that you create a different kind of dynamic and conversation and interaction, which I think is really vital. So that was a great lesson for me in kind of art activism.
We've kind of, since, I mean, Helen can probably talk about this a little bit more, but we've come across the idea of using the butterfly as a kind of symbol. I mean, we've got a group that is looking at our local economy and how we bounce forward after COVID. And we kind of just ended up with this butterfly, and that seems as though it's become a bit of a symbol for us. And it fits in quite well, you know, the idea of how we kind of bounce forward. And I was always very interested in the artwork that was used in malts and the reasons for that, and was quite, you know, when we first saw the butterfly, I thought that feels really good because I know that has worked elsewhere. So we're hoping to be able to expand upon that. But I love the idea of, like you said, it's about this idea of being multi-platform, and you know, and our butterfly or the sunflower in malts, you know, that can appear everywhere. And all of a sudden, you know, people are seeing that all over the place, and they instinctively, you know, they partly know what it means, but at the same time that they're putting their own meaning into what that means. So it becomes a very personal thing. So you're not actually saying this is how you must feel and this is how you must react. It's a very subtle way of doing it, and you're allowing space for people to take ownership of the meaning of, you know, if we, you know, what happened in malts will feel different to every single person. They will put their own kind of life story and their own experiences into that kind of process. And I like the idea that just a sunflower, you can put what you want into that. And obviously, you know, we talked about, you know, the right have been doing this for a long time, you know, and they're very good at it. And while we're sitting around talking about it, they will be doing it. And, you know, Brexit, which, you know, was a perfect example. It was a word, and you ask 1,000 people, we know the general direction of travel, but you ask 1,000 people what Brexit means, and each of them will come up with a different interpretation of what they think. So our butterfly and the sunflower in malts will each have a slightly individual interpretation of what that person what that person feels it means. And that feels quite exciting to me, to kind of open up that space where we're not saying these are the exact, this is what you must feel and this is what you do, because you're excluding people, but you have a general positive direction of travel. And I think people will, you know, they will put their own meaning into that, and that feels a good space to be. So it's interesting that the use of art over there was very, very good. Yeah,
I mean, having those motifs, you know, and kind of points of alignment in some fashion, and you know, whether it's crass or not, I don't know, but even, you know, the marketing piece, just making it simple for people to, you know, understand on their own terms in their own way, as you say, and gravitate toward it, you know, that makes a huge difference. And certainly, you know, the corporate entities have used that incredibly well in what they've done. You know, in fact, the apple growers in malts who were pushing so hard against the people of malts, you know, they adopted the ladybug as their insignia, you know, which is, I just find totally disgusting, because I saw so few ladybugs in the vineyards and orchards when I was working there. You know, smart though. And so, you know, if we can't play at the same game, then, you know, there's probably, and not with the same ethics, but you know, I think we inevitably lose some ground that we could naturally have. And music, you know, I mean, so Phil's responsible for composing the transition theme song for New Mills.
I want to hear it next week. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Philip. But I think, you know, again, you mentioned something that's about reclaiming, you know, and we've talked in the past about reclaiming history, and, you know, and about reclaiming the story of your town and turning that into, you know, because the story of our town, you know, we've been here before. This is nothing particularly, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel. This isn't particularly revolutionary, although sometimes it feels revolutionary because of what we've gone through the past 20 or 30 years. But as I said, the idea of farms being part of our community, it's not revolutionary. That, to me, it feels quite a natural thing. But The problem is we've allowed the story and the art, we've allowed other groups to use it for their own benefit. And I think as communities, we need to start reclaiming some of that. We need to start reclaiming the stories and putting a marker down and saying, you know, this is our town, this is our story, and we're proud of it. And it's not complete, and you know, it's a conversation that is ongoing, but this is ours. You know, it's not the corporate, you know, our food chain is not the corporations, it is ours, and we will do as we see fit to take ownership of that. And that's, in terms of art as well, advertising has done it for a long time, but we need to take that back, I think, as communities, and say, no, this is ours. You know, this means more to us than it does to you. And that's an important, that's the thing I got more from malt, you know, of anything from reading the book, was that people said, no, this is ours. You know, hands off. We will make decisions about our own community as far as we can. And that was what was so inspiring about that story over there.
Well, and it struck me just, you know, looking, well, again, you can tell me whether Wikipedia is right, but, you know, looking, Wikipedia and the history, and, you know, originally the mills being focused on grains, you know, and sort of that, you know, presumably that kind of gathering, you know, just that well, I've always been a kind of fan and some student of history in terms of milling, water power, what that means. I mean, that in many ways was sort of the introduction of a food system for so many cultures, was that milling process. It's also the place where sort of the thievery of the middle started. And, you know, for example, in malts and various medieval iconography throughout that part of the Alps, the bakers are the ones who usually are being flogged in hell or purgatory, because they were the ones who always stole that extra part of grain, you know, from the farmer. And so, you know, in malts, there's and that's where baker's dozen comes from, as you may know, because, you know, you were always getting shorted by the baker. And so you always wanted that extra piece of bread, you know, to make sure that you got your worth. Yeah. So, you know, I just, you know, the whole, that whole piece from an outsider, as you're thinking about it, I mean, it's very striking, that notion of how you might be able to play off of that.
Liz.
Philip, just in case you thought New Mills came from that sort of mill, it doesn't. New Mills was a cotton town, because in the UK, mill just means factory, really, more or less.
Yeah, I was wondering, in the Wikipedia article, it goes back, and, you know, it says there, going back to, I think actually they called it corn milling, and that wasn't maize milling, I'm sure. You know, wondered about that whole use of water power, and, you know, where that might have been associated in, you know, the very early times, pre-cotton, and
long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just point out, Toby's just said that no, Philip is right. So, on the chat. So I don't know any more than that, but I do know. I know obviously there were a lot of mills that were cotton mills, weren't there, Liz?
Yeah, no longer.
But no. Oh, and okay. Sorry, the cotton mills followed on from the existing corn mills.
Thing I didn't before. Thank you.
There you go.
I'll shut up.
And go make Wikipedia a little more explicit in that, Toby.
That's your job, Toby. You need to get onto Wikipedia and make it clear. But actually, one of the things that's happening in the New Mills Festival in September is Toby's organising this home farm New Mills, where, if I'm correct, the various seeds, wheat seeds, are going to be given out to the community to grow our own little farm here that we can then harvest next year. Maybe Toby might be telling us about that now. I'm not quite sure. So I'm really excited about being able to do that and sort of go back to how things were. Has anybody else got any questions? I just had one about using technology, actually. I was just kind of wondering what you felt about how you can use online technologies like we're doing now to talk to you, how we can use it to learn and how we can use it to share experience. If you've got any tips how best to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we're all experimenting and kind of figuring our way through this, and Phil and Rupa have been through some of this too, and trying to gather people. It's certainly interesting, and capturing a certain crowd on Facebook and yet not another crowd. Same for Instagram, and then the LinkedIn world actually is becoming more sophisticated in the food systems world. So I think as you're delving deeper into all things kind of agricultural and even the middle of the food system, LinkedIn has more and more resources and groups that have grown. I mean, I was not a LinkedIn fan for a while, and now I'm beginning to see that blossom more. And then these, some folks certainly gravitate more towards, these sort of closed system online groups. There's one that we're working on now, a platform that we've just started using as a beta, which is SocioHub. I think sometimes people appreciate the ability just to have their own groups and not have Facebook or anyone else peering in. So that's had a certain amount of effectiveness for us. And other kinds of apps and things. I mean, really, sort of by all means, getting the stories out there and doing even, for example, a mapping project. The first one is by no means the last one. It's just kind of a beginning piece, and getting people to collaborate together and trying to put together the story in a digital fashion that doesn't have to stay digital per se, I think is a really fascinating part of the project. And you all have already found your way into that. That's part of what I loved about the book was, at once it was kind of done by hand, and then you found a way to transform it digitally. So you sort of did both in that case, I think I find that really compelling. And, with regard to the marketing platforms that are out there, and I don't know how many are in the UK and being used, that are the direct, which is the right phrase here, direct farmer to consumer apps. Some of those I'm finding are having really good success. The problem is sometimes they're also very fleeting, and you don't know which one is going to stick and kind of be there in the next season. That's a bit of a challenge. So finding one that's got a little bit of heft and staying power to it, I think, is important, because the farmers, if they're going to do something like that, if they're going to spend the time to go to the app, if they're not very sophisticated, it's going to be hard for them to input the products sometimes. My wife is just experimenting with this new platform that the Regenerative Food Network is building. And, as the software developer, you're not thinking like a farmer necessarily. So if you can find one that's user-friendly that people adopt more broadly, I'm seeing those collide in Vermont right now. I don't even know which one to go to. There is not a go-to platform. There's so many of them. And so, do we want a Facebook in that world? Facebook equivalent? I don't think so, but at some point we can't all do different things either.
Yeah, you're very right. I think it's difficult because there's so many things to choose from. You're spending a lot of time trying to get all those different audiences, but if you don't spread that message over those different platforms, then you're clearly missing out on it.
Yeah, and that's where the butterfly motif may be, something that probably inherently has more power to it overall, because it can end up in the stores and the farmers markets, on the farms. The South Tyrol actually also has a really interesting program that they've done a great job called the Rote Hahn, which is the red rooster. So anytime you see, it's kind of a beautiful, it's usually done sort of as a ceramic style. So this beautiful red rooster that you put on your farm if you're a cooperator in the local farming group, for local farm sales and local farm stays. So that's a really interesting piece. One of the things too that I think I didn't point out that's really important in the South Tyrol, one of the ways that the farmers increased their economic viability was by having a guest room or several guest rooms that were available for people to have the farm stays. And obviously that can sort of divert your attention and other things, but I'm finding, especially here in the United States with Airbnb and other things, that there are farmers who are coming in who are having to buy the land, become new farmers, and it's actually something like the Airbnb that's giving them the income and the ability to stay home and do the farming. And so it's sort of dual purpose. So that's a pretty interesting piece. And I guess the one other thing from the South Tyrol that I found really powerful was that there was this collective marketing of restaurants, I would say restaurants, hotels, and guest rooms, that it's not as if, yes, everybody is competing, but whenever the marketing, for example, in your case, is new mills, and it's all about new mills and everybody has their spot, that's got a lot more marketing, heft and oomph to it to really make it work than just the individual farm kind of being out on their own. So that commanding shelf space, I guess, is sort of the equivalent in the grocery store.
Very interesting. Right, has anybody got any final questions? Oh, Phil?
Yeah, it's just well, I've got just a follow on from what you said, and then a question. So you talked about identity then, and about it's almost you kind of branding your community so that you've not got, I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do is to create a network, and people buy into that network. And because am I right in thinking that what you don't want is for there to be 10 separate networks, because the way that social media works, you miss 5 of them, and 5 you know of and 5 you don't, and all of a sudden you're kind of back to this situation where everybody just goes off doing their own thing. And what you're really trying to do is to bring it together and amplify what is there. So the conversation becomes a conversation with all, rather than separate conversations at different points of the compass. Your marketing, your story and narrative, we're talking about kind of bringing all this together. And I think at the beginning when you talked about the conversation, you talked about food and cycling and energy. And again, it was this desire to bring it all together into one network. And do you think that is, how important do you feel that is?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I mean, here in Vermont, and I think in the South Tyrol as well, everybody comes together pretty much in terms of an appreciation of building the local economy and preserving the local landscape. Those two pieces usually don't create too much polarization. I mean, they can get messy for sure. But everybody wants a vibrant local economy, and everybody wants to conserve a landscape that they really appreciate. And so those have been the pieces, I think, that have brought people together in this excuse me in this area as much as any. And as I was saying before, that works way before you get into the conversation about farming practices and those kinds of things. That things get tripped up so fast. And despite what we think about climate, here in the States anyway, I mean, that's also a polarizing conversation at the beginning. But usually after a few conversations, the farming community, they're all recognizing that there are changes afoot. We don't all agree about what to do about it. But so I for myself, I like to kind of withhold those polarizing conversations and, start with the local economy and the landscape and bring people together in that regard. And the next generation, if there's agreement about that, that certainly seems to work well. And having the, food at the center is celebratory. And I think no one has done that any better than Carlo Petrini and slow food. People have different views about slow food and its success, but my gosh, what Carlo and crew did in sort of raising up this whole notion of, food celebration, community, carnival, indigenous foodways. I don't think anyone's done it better on an international scale than Slow Food has. So there are lots of lessons. And I don't know what Slow Food UK is like. And it's kind of a mixed bag here in the States, but been to Terra Madre twice, and what a phenomenal experience just to have all of that at once, that intensity. And that's where it all comes alive. The artist palette and the chef's palette, it's all there.
I ate in Granada in Andalusia, and we had a meal there, and it took 7 hours, and everything was chopped and cooked in front of us, and there was about 10 or 15 of us, and we just chatted and it took, yeah, it was 7 hours for, I think it was something like 15 courses, and it was just mind blowing, you know, and each ingredient had a story behind it. So we were told who made the olive oil, who made the bread, where the olives came from, where the fish was caught, and it was just absolutely stunning. It was. I mean, it was just incredible. But yeah, really mind blowing thing.
Maybe not something for every day, but
No.
definitely once in a while. I think that would be a lovely way of
Yeah, definitely.
learning about and celebrating our food. I think we're going to have to draw things to a close soon. So if there's no pressing questions, I'm just going to ask Philip if he has any words he'd like to say to sum up at the end of this cafe transition.
Sure. Well, again, just compliments on all the work you all have done, and I think you exemplify something that I keep struggling to articulate, but maybe it's not to be articulated in some ways. Maybe it's more, about doing, and that is this whole question of Foodshed as new democracy. I think I really do believe that the work that we're doing and trying to rebuild, recapture, redesign food systems ultimately is about democracy, and it's about the right to food. And if you start Googling around, there are all kinds of definitions of Foodshed, and that's what I was struggling with as I was writing the book. It's kind of that whole, what is a Foodshed? And ultimately, I think I came to the conclusion of what you all are probably exemplifying, and that is that at its very best, Foodshed is really the periphery of our own ability to exert positive change. I think that's what we have to kind of think of it as, what is that radius of impact that we can control? And ultimately, it can't stop there, because we need the constellation of all these different communities coming together. So we do need a convergence and kind of a constellation. But at the very beginning, the work you're doing is the piece that determines whether it's going to be successful or not. So tip of the hat that I don't have, and, kudos to you folks. I'm really eager to see where you take all this. Thanks for inviting me in to learn more about it.
Thank you very, very
much. Have you in Vermont or see you in New Mills? That's
You're always welcome.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you, Philip.